I think the game has areas like this for the sole purpose of wasting the player's time. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term roguelike, which is used to describe an entire genre of games, which all follow a fairly standard dungeon exploration format. Well, if you ever wondered why we call them roguelikes, here's your answer. Today's Ancient DOS game is Rogue, also known as Dungeons of Doom. It is, without a doubt, one of the most influential games ever created. Condensing this game down into a simple review is a little tricky because of the extremely large number of different versions of this game out there. For instance, the player's armor rating originally got better the higher it got, but then at some point this was changed around to be more like Dungeons & Dragons, and thus the lower the armor rating, the better it was. Early versions also didn't show you your experience points, opting instead to just give you new ranks each time you got enough experience to level up, unless you were on a Unix system which already had the experience counter. So for the sake of my sanity and to keep things from getting overly confusing, I decided to stick with the version I was most familiar with for this review, version 1.49. Despite its text mode appearance, this game has a surprisingly large amount of content given how old it is. So while it doesn't look the part, it certainly has a lot of gameplay behind it. It's also brutally difficult at times due to its pseudo-randomly generated nature, thus each time you play through you'll sometimes get really far, maybe even to the 26th level, or sometimes you may end up dead right on the second. Either way, the whole game is based around making the trip over and over again until you finally win. Rogue started life as a Unix game in 1980, developed by Michael Toy, who went on to create another more advanced dungeon crawl known as NetHack, and Kenneth Arnold, mostly noted for his work on the Ultima games, but also involved with NetHack. The port to IBM PCs was handled by John Lane and published originally through Artificial Intelligence Design in 1983, a company originally known as Artificial Intelligence Design Systems, before they kind of realized that acronym wasn't coming across the way they intended it to. 2 years later, though, in 1985, publishing shifted over to Epix. Almost all of the DOS copies in circulation are Epix versions of the game. It is a one-player dungeon crawl featuring 80 by 25 16-color text mode graphics, though it also uses CGA 320 by 200 4-color graphics for the title screen, and I do believe it has monochrome display support. It technically has PC speaker sound, but as far as I know, the only sound effect in the entire game is this very quick noise you hear when you spring a trap. There might be others, but since I've never beaten the game, I have no idea. As for its current release date, it's hard to pin down exactly when it happened, but for quite some time now, the game's not only been freeware, but its source code has also been available. One of the best places to go if you want to download various versions of the original game, along with the source code if so desired, is the Dungeon Dweller website at www.roguelikedevelopment.org. If you want to get a physical copy, you're going to need a lot of luck and a lot of money, as they are extremely rare and tend to fetch pretty high prices. The only copy I could find for sale as of this recording was on eBay for $100, brand new and still sealed. And it wasn't even the DOS version, it was the Tandy Color computer version. Needless to say, copies of this game are major collector's items now. Yes, there is actually a story to this game. Well, sort of. It actually changes depending on if you're playing one of the original copies or the Epix versions. Basically, with the Epix games, you play the role of a true seeker on a quest for the Amulet of Yendor, a beautiful and ancient artifact left behind by the magicians of old to remind mankind of its origins. This artifact has long since been stolen by the evil Dungeon Lord, and few have ever dared to adventure for it. The seeker you play as, however, has had the strangest and most profound desire to search for this amulet, and one day he discovers its hiding place, a massive dungeon controlled by the Dungeon Lord himself, hidden behind a simple moss-covered stone. Upon entering, though, and getting slaughtered by the denizens within, our protagonist learns that the rumors are true. Those who truly seek the amulet are gifted with eternal life and come back from the dead should they be killed. However, this blessing is also a curse since you're in the Dungeon Lord's domain now. While dead, your body is returned back up to the entrance, and the dungeon itself shifts around, making each attempt to find the amulet as new and as difficult as the first. This seeker has long since forgotten his name from his many lifetimes of failed attempts to retrieve the amulet. But one day, just one day, he's hoping he will obtain it and use its powers to leave these dungeons forever and feel the warmth of the afternoon sun on his face once again. For those of you who've never played a roguelike or even a dungeon crawl, the premise is fairly simple. The game is played from an overhead perspective, and your goal is to basically explore the dungeon, finding equipment to help you survive as you delve deeper and deeper. The deeper you go, the more difficult the monsters become, but the more powerful the equipment you will find. With this game in particular, you're trying to get down to level 26. Once there, you can find the Amulet of Yendor, which grants you the ability to go up staircases, thus meaning you have to make your way back to level 1 and out in order to escape and win the game. What makes Rogue highly addictive is the large amount of different items you can find and the variety of things you can actually do. For instance, when you find a potion, you can not only quaff it to experience its effects, but if you know that the potion's effects are bad for your health, you can throw that potion at an enemy instead to inflict its effects on that enemy. The world is also pseudo-randomly generated, so every adventure into the dungeons will have a different layout and different items to find, meaning some trips will work out much better than others depending on what you come across and when. Given that this is one of the first dungeon crawls ever made, there's a number of limitations to how the game works compared to later dungeon crawls, which are usually even more difficult and more unforgiving, despite having numerous additional features. For instance, each level in Rogue takes up a single screen and can only have up to 9 rooms, each laid out in a roughly grid-like pattern. Also, there's no stores or ways to spend your gold in this game, effectively making gold nothing more than a scoring system. In terms of survival, you have some basic stats at the bottom of the screen to keep track of: level, hits, strength, gold, armor, and your present rank. Level is the dungeon level that you're currently on. As you go deeper, everything gets harder. Hits is basically your health, with the maximum value shown in parentheses. If your health runs out, you die. Strength is primarily a factor of how well you engage in combat. The higher your strength, the more often you'll hit things. There's also a maximum strength value, as some of the things you encounter can damage your strength. Gold, as I already mentioned, is simply worth points for the high score table. Armor determines how easily enemies can hit you. In this version of the game, higher armor results in better protection, but in later versions this was reversed. As for your rank, this is basically how you'll track your experience levels. You gain new ranks from fighting monsters and gaining experience. Each new rank increases your maximum health, if nothing else. Controlling your character can be a little tricky at first, since there's an extremely large number of controls, some of which are dependent on holding a shift key down. So here's what it basically comes down to. You use the numeric keypad to move around, you attack simply by running into enemies, you wield different weapons with the W key, you wear new armors by pressing Shift W, you can see your inventory with I, you can throw things with T, you can take off armor with Shift T, you can eat food with E, you can quaff potions with Q, you can read scrolls with R, and if you haven't figured it out yet, a massive number of these commands could have been condensed into a simple use button, because I'm not even done with these yet. But I think you get the general idea. There's a ton of controls, and it can take a while to memorize them all. So pressing Shift ? To get the control list up is something you're going to be doing a lot. One key that's a little interesting though is the F key, which is described in-game as find something. It can also be thought of as a fast movement key, since when you press F, followed by a direction key, your character will run in the direction and even follow through passageways and corners until something happens, either encountering an item, encountering an enemy, or reaching an intersection of some kind. Using the F key can not only greatly speed up playing the game, but it also helps to avoid the potential of pressing a movement key repeatedly, only to end up getting attacked several times by an enemy that just appears out of nowhere. Another way to speed things up more safely than usual is by typing in a number followed by the command you want to perform. This will actually produce that command as many times as you typed in. For instance, if you want to rest for 100 turns to restore your health, you could either hold the period key down to rest that long, which runs the risk of getting assaulted by an enemy multiple times, Or you can type in the number 100 and press the period key, and the game will automatically attempt to rest 100 times. But more importantly, will stop resting the instant something happens to you. One of the big things you have to be careful about, though, is that not every item you come across is good. And many of the items you find are completely undescriptive, like colored potions, scrolls with illegible names, staves that are simply made out of some kind of wood. Even weapons and armor don't tell you how well they work when you first find them. For all of this, you have two options. You can take a risk and attempt to use an item just to see what happens, or if you have an identify scroll, you can identify an item to get all the details about it. From there, you should be able to tell whether something will help or hinder you. Now, the game usually won't throw a lot of identify scrolls your way, unlike a lot of later dungeon crawls which have identification capabilities all over the place. So you need to be very particular about how you use these things. Staves, wands, and scrolls are typically the safest things to use without first identifying them. Potions are also fairly safe, so long as you're up to full health. Weapons, armors, and rings, though, these things you definitely want to identify first, since if you use one of these and it turns out to be cursed, you can't take it off again without first using a scroll to remove that curse. It's also important to note that sometimes when you use something, you'll just be given a description of what it does and will be left to name it yourself. If you recognize the effect it has, you can name it based on that effect, but if you don't recognize the effect, you'll just have to type something in for the interim, and later on you can rename it if you finally figure it out. Or just use an identify scroll. In fact, the game is pretty much designed to be played multiple times in a row. I don't think a single person on the face of this planet has ever beaten this game on their very first try. And heck, I've never actually beaten it myself. The game's incredibly difficult and unforgiving the further down you get, even though at first it may seem like a cakewalk. I do have some tips that should really help you guys out, and my first major tip is to rest whenever your health gets low. You regenerate health per number of turns passed, and this includes when you just wait around doing nothing with the period key. Just remember that monsters spawn in routinely, so try to rest around the staircase in the event that you need to make a hasty retreat. My next tip is that if you find a ring of slow digestion during your travels, wear it for as long as you can. It's very rare to do a run where you don't eventually run out of food, so the ring of slow digestion will help to ensure that your food supplies will last longer. My next tip is to memorize which enemies will give you the most troubles. A couple good ones to make note of early on are the rattlesnakes and the aquators. Rattlesnakes can poison you, which drops your strength by 1 point, while the aquators damage the armor you're wearing every time they hit you. Try to avoid rattlesnakes if you're not able to avert their strength damaging effects, and take your armor off before fighting an aquator so they can't damage it. It's also possible to get rings that can help protect you from these effects, so keep an eye out for them. A good tip for the very late sections of the game is to make a run for the amulet once you get deep enough. Most expert rogue players tend to race around the last 6 levels, getting through them in both directions as fast as possible, since the enemies there are extremely deadly. If you happen to fall through a trapdoor on level 26 though before you get the amulet, you might as well just give up since there's no way back up if that happens. Finally, my last tip isn't really so much a tip as it is something worth noting. Now, some players may be confused about how to use the bow and arrow. It's actually simple enough, just weird. You first have to wield your bow and arrow with the W key, then you quote-unquote throw arrows with the T key. Any arrows thrown while a bow is equipped will cause proper amounts of damage, whereas if you don't have a bow equipped, you will literally just toss the arrow by hand, which won't do anywhere near as much damage. Rogue is a classic in every sense of the word. It spawned an entire genre of games, and more such games are being made every year, some of which are surprisingly faithful to the original formula. While Rogue is typically easier than most similar dungeon crawls following it, despite being pretty difficult in the first place, it's also got the least features. So if you've never played a dungeon crawl before, it can be a good starting point. But players who are really into dungeon crawls will probably prefer the more advanced games of today to this classic. If you're one of those people though, and you've never checked out Rogue itself, it's still a good idea to play it at least once to see where it all began. Setting this game up in DOSBox requires zero configuration. Just leave cycle set to auto and you're good to go. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Things have been extremely busy around here again, especially with the new YouTube channel up and running now, so I'm going to stick with the text mode theme for the next couple of games. Maybe we can call this Text Mode July or something like that. In any case, next week's game will also be a text mode game, but instead of being a dungeon crawl, it'll be an action game that kind of feels like it was inspired by the Indiana Jones movies. If you think you know which game it is, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned as we take a look at how an action game can even work with nothing but ASCII characters.